Today we are talking to Ben Korstvedt, who is the person who initially suggested to me that we do this performance. And my big question is, what are they going to hear that's different from when they would normally hear if somebody said, you're going to hear Bruckner's Fourth Symphony today?
That's a great question. Much of the music is very familiar to the usual version of the Fourth Symphony, but there are significant differences in this slow movement, and the finale is completely different. In the slow movement, about 2/3 of the way through the movement, there is a passage that was still in the score at this point in time that Bruckner removed later. And it's a remarkable stretch of music. It's a very personal, very quiet music. There are little dialogues between solo instruments and the strings, and it sort of dies away to this kind of point of uncertainty, and then the final section of the movement begins. And remarkably, I do not believe this music has ever been performed publicly. It was rehearsed when Bruckner first was rehearsing it, but at the time of the performance, partly to shorten the length of the music, he removed it and never put it back. So that's different. And then the last movement is a different movement that Bruckner removed quite abruptly and replaced with the familiar version of the finale. It's somewhat similar. Some of the music is recognizable. Some of it's quite different. The tone of the piece is different. And Bruckner at one point suggested that it should be called the Volksfest, or the popular festival, or something like, almost like a fair, which is quite remarkable. So that's different. And some of the music is really striking. The way it opens with this sort of slightly uncanny pizzicato in the strings is really kind of neat, for example.
It seems like this sort of version has been kind of cursed to not be performed, because initially Bruckner had intended to perform it and then withdrew it, right?
The finale he withdrew before that.
Right.
He was clearly preparing to perform it in this version, and the materials were all copied, or almost completely copied. And many of the parts, the old finale is either removed or just crossed out in heavy pencil.
Right.
But during the rehearsals, there was a fairly large cut made in the Andante, much bigger than later.
Oh, okay.
And then later, Bruckner went back and reinstated almost all the music except for this one passage that's not there. One
of the things I think that we need to look at is Bruckner as tinkerer. And he was an inveterate tinkerer. I mean, we normally say there's three versions of this symphony. There's the 1874 version, which wasn't performed until the 1970s.
Correct.
Then there's the familiar version, the 1881. And then there's a later version that was the first published version. You were central to the whole rethinking of how Bruckner is perceived. I mean, there was this perception of Bruckner as sort of this kind of person who couldn't resist the ideas of other people, and the symphony, that the last revision that he did, was not his idea largely. It was the idea of other people.
It is a remarkable story. Bruckner composed the symphony in 1874, tried to get it performed, that fell apart, revisited the symphony, rewrote it quite fundamentally, producing the version you're going to perform.
Right.
Then as that came to performance, he continued to modify it and adjust it. It was performed once quite successfully under Richter. It was performed in December of that year, and it was a complete fiasco. And it was not performed again for years. And then Bruckner came back to it, and particularly a conductor named Hermann Levy was very influential in getting it performed again and getting it published. And before it was published, Bruckner revisited it, and with assistance, there's no doubt that there was some collaboration with some of his younger colleagues, particularly in the orchestration, and modifications, improvement, I would say, of the structure of the finale.
Oh, yeah.
It was published. And the way I got into this was, a long time ago as a graduate student. After Haas's time, the manuscript that was used to publish the symphony in 1888 had come to light. And it raised a lot of really interesting questions. And I began to see that there were some very interesting things going on, and also a much better way to explain it than the sort of the standard myth that's developed that Bruckner was either tricked or coerced or persuaded against his will to make these changes.
Everybody should realize the 1874 version was considered at the time pretty much unplayable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the last movement and the cross rhythms between the five. You've got all these bars with these fives, and he's got these cross rhythms against it.
Yeah.
By the 1970s when it was performed, people were used to that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't think it did.
Yeah.
But it is a remarkable change. And the version we're doing of the finale, the Folkfest, was essentially a simplification, wasn't it, of that version in many ways? Would you say that?
Yes, it's shorter. It's
yes.
a little bit tighter. Right, those quintuplet rhythms are generally, sort of normalized into quarter notes and eighth notes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it does, but it's clearly derived very directly from that first version.
If you're used to that opening of the last movement, which is very striking in the mm-hmm. later versions, in the version that we normally hear, this is extremely different, and it's peculiar too. It's this mm-hmm. chromatic thing, and you don't know where it's going. I mean, it sets you up in a very, very different way. It doesn't have that certainty that you're used to. It's
that's right.
You're going, okay, where are we going to go with this? And it's different. I think people should also be aware that the version we're doing has sometimes been heard separately, as they've sort of extracted that movement mm-hmm. in our version and played it separately. It's been extremely rare. I don't know how many performances have actually done it with the Folkfest version attached to the symphony.
I don't think it's ever been performed in the United States.
Just attaching the Folkfest to the symphony as a coherent picture is something that, I know from my point of view, it's like I'm looking at it in a very different way. I mean, it completely changes the way I perceive the first movement, because the relationship between the first and last has been completely modified by using that different finale. Like, I can't look at the first movement the same way I would mm-hmm. as if I was doing it with the normal finale. I go, oh no, that has a different relationship because of the way he brings in material from the first movement into the last, and it's different, Yeah,
so very interesting. Yeah, then the sort of the overall, the sort of the long arc of the symphony is inevitably different with a different finale.
Sometimes when composers modify their music,
mm-hmm.
sometimes it improves it, sometimes it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Some composers have been very good with it. Bruckner is kind of a mixed bag on that, isn't he?
Yeah, well, with the Fourth Symphony, I think there's a couple of things that I think are relevant here. One is that Bruckner composed his second, third, fourth, and fifth symphonies one after another over the course of 4 years.
Yep.
And it was a time when he was really developing his conception as a symphonic composer.
Right.
And the Fourth Symphony, he said from the beginning, this is a popular, accessible symphony.
Yeah.
He wanted to write one that would sort of speak to a large audience. And his over the course of his development of the symphony, it continually moves in a direction of being more effective, more communicative, more direct. I think that really, for me anyway, really helps me comprehend what he was doing in the revisions of that symphony.
Right.
And he clearly succeeded. I mean, it's been his most popular symphony ever since.
Right. And that's a kind of interesting thing, because if you take a look at the Fifth Symphony, it's derived from the first version of the Fourth Symphony. It's an extension of that.
Mm-hmm.
If you take a look at the later versions of the Fourth Symphony, they're from a later period in his development.
Yeah.
And the Fifth, he never revised really,
Right. And it's a very intellectual symphony with that incredibly complicated fugal finale. It's a different animal.
The version we're doing is actually slightly later conceptually. It's simplified, it's structurally much tighter. And then he tightened it even more because the version the first version that you edited was the 1888 version, wasn't it?
That's right.
That was the first one.
Yep.
I like the last version best. And the part of the reason I like it best, and this is a whole discussion, is there is a slight disconnect between his orchestration in that version and some of the thinking. Is his orchestration had evolved considerably by the late 1880s.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
And the orchestration is smoother. It doesn't have those rough edges that you're going to hear in our version. It's been smoothed over. Some people don't like that. I mean, it's one of the reasons that people are so opposed to the later version of the First Symphony, as an example, where the disconnect is huge.
Yeah,
I like it.
that is a common opinion, that there is some sort of imbalance or is something that's maybe not quite organic about it.
Right.
I think one very essential and simple fact is that Bruckner, that was what Bruckner wanted to publish, and that was and I think we need to respect that.
Yes.
And the orchestra, the last version of the Fourth Symphony is a very good example of the desire on Bruckner's part to create something that was going to be effective and communicative.
Right.
And I think it also does, and here's where he received advice, it does reflect certain practicalities about performance, the way the brass writing, and Bruckner had a very direct, effective, and simple way of scoring for the brass off and using them as a mass, which is very impressive. But in the later versions and the later symphonies, there's a little bit more nuance to the way the brass are used at times.
Yeah.
The other thing that is extremely important about the final version is that it contains a complete set of tempo markings and performance markings, which I'm quite certain that what happened is Bruckner began to realize he needed to explain the music a little bit more clearly to conductors. And a crucial episode in this was the success of the Seventh Symphony in 1884, which was a real public success. And I think Bruckner learned a lot from that process, including how to convey his wishes to conductors more and more effectively.
We know that he did want his music to be heard. He did want it to be performed, and he did want people to like it.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a legitimate thing. It's not him being weak.
That's why people compose. I mean,
right.
Well, and I think the narrative that developed in the 20th century, that Bruckner was a neglected master who had been, sort of suppressed by his era and so forth. And then this notion that my time will come, and that later generations sort of saved him. I mean, that's an appealing narrative. There is something appealing to us that we now grasp the true Bruckner the way that his era couldn't.
Right.
But it's not. It's really is more of a myth than historical truth.
One thing, and I think people might find interesting, is among the first recordings of Bruckner that were made were several done with a salon orchestra of some of the scherzos from some of the symphonies, including Symphony Zero, which is kind of bizarre.
It's true. It's remarkable. Yeah.
And you listen to those, and boy, does that give you a different idea of who this composer was. There was a disconnect between writing these grand symphonies and somebody who had an accent that, to put it in an American context, was something like Jed Clampett in the Beverly Hillbillies, right?
Yeah.
That upper Austrian accent that was regarded as very, very not a cool way to speak if you're in very, very snobbish Vienna circles.
Right.
That was just very peculiar. But the music does reflect more than this grandiose thing. There is that human element.
Very much.
And so. I find it in the Volksfest, I find it very strong.
Yep.
I find
agree.
It very, very, in that movement we're doing that isn't usually done. It's there in spades. It's there in all the scherzos.
Yeah.
The trios always have a very strong folk element.
Yeah.
But in that movement, you go, okay, this is also the humanizing element of Bruckner that I think is something that sometimes we in that sort of grandiose notion of them, and it's missing. I mean, he did connect humanly in a certain way.
And in the Volksfest, there are some passages that are really very dance-like.
Yes,
and I think that's an important piece of it. The other thing that I think some of those early recordings reveal is that in his time and for decades afterwards, Bruckner was seen as a dangerously modernistic composer.
Yes.
Not a kind of, sort of very stolid classic composer of massive cathedrals, but someone who was really experimenting. The intensity of the harmonic and motivic work in his symphonies is really quite radical.
He went to extremes. His handling of pedal is just staggering, And I do want to say one last thing before we go. Those metronome markings, I take those very seriously, and I'm going to reapply them in my thinking of this version from the last version, because they are the most revealing things, and conductors usually don't follow them.
No, they don't. No. Well, actually, one other difference in this version that you'll be performing, the andante quasi allegretto was still marked in alla breve.
Yes.
And that clearly implies a different rhythmic feel, and that it always seemed to me odd that very rarely do you hear a performance that has anything like a quasi allegretto flavor to it.
That's right.
It should be there, and that again, that brings that more sort of human lightness of touch to the music. I
do want to put one more thing in: size of the orchestra. The later symphonies, 7, 8, and 9. He's got triple winds. He's got all that.
Wagner.
That's right. You got the Wagner tubas and all that sort of stuff. When you do that, maybe you do want really, really huge string sections. I find the music, when you do them with smaller string sections, you get tremendous rhythmic energy that's lacking when you start to becomes too string dominated when you're using 16 first violins.
Yeah, that's right. The woodwinds in particular can be lost. I mean, the brass always comes through, but they
always come. Yeah, right, because of how he wrote for them, among other things. But
right.
But the winds, which are so important in terms of his texture. I mean, all you have to do is look at an oboe player's face at the end of the fourth movement and they're just sitting there doing all this. Right. They've been playing a lot, and you want to make sure they get heard if they've been playing that much.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we are going to use a somewhat smaller size, but the part of that is it's choice. It's partly that I do want that transparency. When we did 0, I felt it made a huge difference to use a smaller size, and it gave I felt it gave us a lot of energy. And in this one, I'm looking forward to that too.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's very exciting. I mean, and how often is it possible to give the first performance of a symphony by a famous composer that hasn't been heard?